Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, I'm Sarah and I make equestrian content here on YouTube. Today I am going to actually be jumping into a little bit of a controversial topic. I've been doing a lot of research. If you guys have been following the channel, you know I have 2 young horses, and the age at which you start a horse under saddle is super widely debated online and in real life. And so I wanted to go ahead and dive into the research and see what does research actually have to say about when is the ideal time to start a horse under saddle. So I've been pulling loads of research articles and doing lots of reading over the last couple weeks so that I could come here and share with you guys my thoughts and opinions on what these research articles actually had to say. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, and I will get into all the nitty-gritty of what I've been reading and my thoughts and what everything is kind of come out to be. Hi, Shorty. If you've been here for a minute, you know I have 2 young horses of my own, Vagar, who is 3.5, Shorty, who is 2.5, and I've just really been wanting to jump into the research just because every time I talk about this topic with different people, everyone seems to have their own opinion. I will say traditionally, I've always had horses that are started at 2 or 3 and they've gone on to have long careers. I know people who choose to wait much longer than that, and it's really an interesting how many different opinions there are on this topic. So rather than going out on the internet and just looking for advice on what other people have to say, I've decided to dig deep into the research. I've been looking at articles the last few weeks and doing a bunch of reading, and it was honestly really fun to do the reading and learn different things. I'm going to be going ahead and including a bunch of these articles in the description down below. So if you guys want to do your own reading, I definitely encourage it. You know, the best thing to do when you want to have information is go directly to the source. So I encourage you to watch this full video, see my opinions, but also go and do your own research. You know, if you want to know what to do to help your horse or to become a better horseman, go read, go do your research, go learn. You know, there's so much to learn with these horses, and this has just been a really fun and exciting topic for me. I love all the things that I got to read and just the different viewpoints and opinions within these articles. And I think this is just going to be the beginning for a bunch of relearning and reading that I'm going to be doing in the future. But let's go ahead and dive into the topic. What does research say about when is the ideal time to start a horse under saddle? So growing up in the horse industry, I grew up mostly with a Western riding background, and I also grew up around race horses. So for me, it was really common to see horses who were started under saddle as 2 or 3-year-olds. And that was just common practice. That's what I grew up knowing. I know this isn't really the case for everyone. There's different viewpoints on this and different practices that people follow. The Spanish riding school, for one example, they're a really well-renowned educational source for horses, and they wait to start their horses under saddle until they are 4 years old. So that's just kind of, you know, some basics that there is when it comes to starting horses. That's just, you know, history, a little bit of background, so you guys have that going into this topic. Another thing I want to touch on is going into it, a lot of people like to bring up that, you know, warm bloods and draft horses, they're larger horses, and so a lot of people say that, you know, larger horses take longer to develop than, say, a quarter horse. So these are all topics that I really wanted to research. I wanted to see, do these larger horses develop faster? And I'm actually have Mr. Large Horse coming to investigate the video setup. Hi, buddy. Don't get my camera. So we have these large horses, and we're just wondering, do they really grow slower than your regular horses, or do they grow at the same rate? So what does research have to say about that? My other large horse. Hi, Vagar. Don't touch my camera. All right. So what does research have to say about the growth rates of these large horses? what's their life look like, and let's dive into this topic. I really wanted to memorize this whole script, but honestly, I wrote so many notes, it's going to be hard to just go off the script and not be looking at it and make sure I don't miss any of the points for you guys, because I have like 8 pages of notes here from the research that I've been reading. So I will be referencing on my little tablet a little bit, so please forgive me for that. But moving into it, so what does research have to say about starting young horses? We need to look at some really primary topics when it comes to this. So I kind of broke down the research into a few different topics. I started with bone and joint development. I looked at long-term outcomes for the horses, how different types of exercise can affect tissue adaptation, and then I also looked into the differences amongst breeds and their growth rates. So those were the main points that I felt would give me the best overall view for starting young horses and how it affects them in the long run. So that's what I chose to jump into. So the first thing I want to talk about is the bone and joint development. So this seems to be the biggest topic when it comes to when to start a young horse, is that structurally a horse is not done growing until they're 5 to 6 years old, which is, according to research, that is true. Let's talk a bit about the biology of bone and joint growth. Research shows that most growth plates in the horse close at about 5 years of age, and the sequence of this closure is pretty consistent across breeds. So that consistency means whether it is a Shetland pony or a Shire, it is going to be the same closure rate and growth rate regardless of the horse. When these growth plates, which growth plates are in any animal with a skeleton, so we have it in humans, we have it in horses, and it's just when it's how our bones continue to lengthen and grow as we age. So when these growth plates close has been a standard measure of when to start horses for over 50 years. I went back and I found a older article by Mason and Burke, and it was focusing on the closure of the distal radial epiphysis and its relationship to unsoundness in 2-year-old thoroughbreds. And the paper was just what its title suggests. It looks for the relationship between the closure of the distal radial epiphysis, which is just above the knee, and the overall soundness of 2-year-old horses. So this paper goes back, it's the origin where, as equestrians, a lot of you have probably heard you don't want to start a horse until their knees close. You got to x-ray their knees and check their knees. So this is where those comments are going back to, and what they're referencing is this particular research paper by Mason and Burke. But this paper was published in 1973, so it's a bit old at this point. It's 2025, it's over 50 years old at this point. But the paper ultimately found no correlation between when these closures happen and lameness within the horse. If you go through and read the paper, the authors note that they ultimately did not find any correlation between the age at which the horse's knees closed and when they were started and unsoundness. So basically, they had horses that were raced and exercised with their knees open, and they had perfectly sound careers. And then they had horses also who were raced closed, who had sound careers. But the opposite was true for both as well. So the paper found no correlation between horses that were started before their knees closed and horses that were started after their knees closed, and if they were unsound at the end of their 2-year-old racing season. So the authors did go on to suggest that these knees do get examined as a precaution, just because they did not have a reason for they did not find a particular reason for the unsoundness. So they did recommend that you x-ray the knees just as a baseline precaution, even though there was no correlation found. So that's where that check their knees, x-ray their knees before you start them, that's where all that started from. I did find a comment within the paper that I found was extremely interesting, especially because it seems like in the horse world, we're always debating when is the time to start a horse. The authors, they noted in the research that during the research, the trainers who were unwilling to wait were also more likely to medicate a horse and try and push the horse through an issue rather than pause training and allow the horse time to heal properly, which caused further issues in the individual horses. There's a bit more nuance to go along with the problem though. Bone strength and musculoskeletal conditioning aren't just about when the growth plates close. According to research, bones need dynamic weight-bearing exercise during youth to develop density and resilience. Research has also shown, and here's a direct quote, exposing the influenceable skeletal structure of young horses to dynamic loading during development could optimize the skeleton through maturity, thus leading to a lower chance of musculoskeletal injury. It also shows that their skeletal strength is highly influenced by the strains their bones undergo through daily use and exercise. So bones change in relation to the loads that it's exposed to. This means that if you want to produce bone that is hard enough to withstand the loads it's seeing, you need to carefully expose the bone to these loads, to these forms of exercise. If you don't expose the bone to this sort of stimulus early on, you narrow the opportunity for tissue adaptation and increase the risk of major musculoskeletal injury. I found this really interesting. I've always gone with the idea that it's better to start a horse lightly early, but it doesn't harm them to wait. But with this research, it almost seems as if the mindset is kind of flawed, because these papers are showing that if you wait to start a horse, they're more likely to undergo a major catastrophic injury than if you started them at a younger age. And it's not to say that you can't wait to start a horse, and that riding a horse or starting a horse when they're older is just a horrible idea. That's not what these papers are saying at all. It's just saying that older horses have a limited ability to adapt when compared to these younger horses. These older horses, when you wait to start them, that time period that you wait could have a significant impact on their athletic future. Not that they can't be great athletes, but that you didn't set them up fully to be the best athlete they could be. That being said, not every horse is going to be a major athlete. Not every horse needs to be a major athlete, but it is something to consider when we're looking at this research and trying to decide when we want to send a horse into training. One of the richest sources of data when it comes to horses, and I mean riches as in the most amount of data, not highest money in data, but most amount of available data comes from the thoroughbred racing industry, simply because of the meticulous records that they keep. So I looked at a bunch of studies from Australia, who has been a major producer of research over the last few years, and they did a massive study of over 117,000 horses and found that horses who started their racing career at 2 years old actually had longer careers and fewer retirements due to injury than those horses who started their careers at a later age. This study did note that the lack of data on the horses that were sent to training but did not make it to the track was not included. It was not data they had readily available. So I will comment, and that is a flaw to that study. But I did find it interesting that they recommended conducting a similar study with more available data. So I'm really looking forward to that. Hopefully they are able to do that. And the other really interesting thing about that is I'm more familiar with the racing here in the US, and these horses, when they race in the US, they have more pressure to compete at a younger age than you do abroad. And in Australia, these horses are not restricted to only racing when they're younger. And so just because a horse was started at 2 didn't mean they got more races because they were younger. There was no capping point for these horses that was noted in the study. So a horse could start at 2 and keep racing till they're 10 or older. There were also a bunch of interesting studies on thoroughbreds and standardbreds that show that horses started in light work, emphasis on light work, at around 2 years old often end up with stronger bones, healthier cartilage, and even longer athletic careers compared to horses who were started later. There were other large-scale studies that were also conducted in the last couple years that confirmed this pattern. Horses who entered training earlier tended to have stronger skeletal systems and were less prone to catastrophic breakdowns later in life. So the myth that starting a 2-year-old ruins a horse isn't really supported by the evidence and research. In fact, delaying until 2 or 3 actually seems to be increasing the risk of injury. But an important thing to remember is these research studies are looking at the top athletes. These are looking at horses that are going from living in a pasture to competing at the highest level, working the hardest loads. So the injuries that you were seeing of these racehorses doing major catastrophic injuries, they weren't even injuries that were due to a horse's development. So another really interesting line of research that I dove into was how different tissues respond to exercise in young horses. There were so many research studies they would do there were so many controlled research studies showing that short dynamic bouts of exercise during growth, like sprinting in a pasture or short periods of training, lead to stronger bone architecture, healthier articular cartilage, and more robust tendons. So I found that really interesting. So it's like the more these horses were exposed to exercise, the stronger their bones were developed. But very important to note, on the flip side, if a horse is raised in a stall and provided minimum exercise, even if they begin training at a later age, they show weaker bone and cartilage, and their bones and cartilage are much more vulnerable to injury. In other words, a horse that is raised with early exposure to controlled work is better adapted for a lifetime of athletic use. I think it's really important to note the negative impacts of having a horse stalled 24/7. It's such a common practice in so many places. People will want to stall their horses to reduce their injury, and they're essentially, don't knock my camera. Move, shorty. Go that way. Can you move your butt? I think it's really important to note the negative impacts of having horses confined in a stall 24/7. It is so important for these horses to be turned out, not just for their physical health, but for their mental health as well. And while I do think horses should be exposed to having stalls just in case they are ever injured or they do need to travel for whatever reason, you can lower their stress by having them aware of what the stall is for. As much time as you can give them out in the world, in the pasture, doing their own thing, it is so much healthier for the horse in the long run, all around. But moving on, that's another topic entirely. So I found another article published earlier this year, and it was one of the first ones I found of these types of articles, and I thought it was extremely interesting. So Harboy et al., this is a 2025 research study. They looked at the effects of They looked at the effects of exercise speed and circle diameter on bone and joint health. So this research study, they used sheep as a model for horses, and there were other studies that were similar as well. They used cattle, but We see horses of all ages in the horse industry exercising in circles. If you've been on my channel, you've seen me lunge horses. You see horses doing circles out in warm-up rings at horse shows, whether you've got them riding or they're working on the ground. Circles is like the most common shape that horses are exercised in. Everyone is always focusing on can they do a better circle? What does their circle look like? So this research study actually looked at the effects of moving in a circle on a horse. We see horses of all ages working in circles constantly, whether it's on a lunge line, round pen, under saddle. These studies show that the movements do actually create abnormal changes within the bone and joint structures. So it's really important to note that these studies were conducted in a controlled manner with the animals, with their animal models, and they had these animals moving in only one direction. So if you've worked with horses and you've lunged them before, you know, everyone always says what you do on one side, you do on the other. So if you lunge them for 5 minutes one way, you lunge them for 5 minutes the other. You're always wanting to make sure you balance them out. And that's also from a fitness aspect. Just as a person, you wouldn't, only do, curls on left hand and never do curls on the right hand. Then your muscles are going to be all whack. So the researchers, while they did note that they created abnormal changes, they did acknowledge that the study only has these animals moving in one direction. So we don't know if the animals, if they did a controlled study, again, having the animals moving balanced, so moving the same amount of time to the left as to the right, if that would counteract these abnormal changes. But it gives you a lot to think about when it comes to exercising horse and doing these circles. Here's a direct quote from the Harbawi et al. Paper published in 2025. It says, further studies are needed to determine the full effects of circular exercise on bone and joint health. All these effects may be influenced by the presence of a rider, gait, session intensity, or changes in direction, but despite the need for continued research in this area, the results from the study suggest that circular exercise does indeed result in asymmetric physiological changes to the musculoskeletal system. So these studies are definitely ones to keep in mind when training horses of any age. So another area of research I decided to dive into that I think is extremely relevant to starting young horses is the amount of workload and the age of the horse. So workload is a very important factor when it comes to starting a horse, because starting a horse looks very different to almost everyone that you ask. So starting will require different workload depending on the trainer that is doing the work with that particular horse. And I think it's really important to separate age from workload when we're looking at starting horses. I know that sounds really crazy when you hear it, but hear me out for a second. Studies consistently show that the biggest risk factor for injuries is not the age when the training begins, but how much and how quickly that workload ramps up. So there have been studies that note the first year of training carries the highest risk of musculoskeletal breakdown regardless of the age of the animal. And that makes so much sense when you think about it. Like when you go out and do sports as a person, you're more likely to hurt yourself running if you've never ran before. You're more likely to hurt yourself playing football if you've never played football before. So according to these studies, it's not really likely that the age is the biggest risk factor for these horses, but actually starting going into sport. Any athlete, be it human, equine, canine, they're generally considered to be at the greatest risk of injury when they first start their training, and the risk decreases as the body adapts to these new challenges. So horses in particular, horses that are pushed into very high accumulated workloads over short periods are at a higher risk of musculoskeletal injuries regardless of the age. So a really important thing to note when working with younger horses is that they accumulate these loads quicker than older horses, which means these young horses need shorter sessions of moderate intensity and longer periods of rest in between these sessions, especially after a higher intensity workout. So the big takeaway here is that early work is safe, when it's done gradually, progressively, and at the appropriate rate for the horse's stage of development. So if you've been with our channel before, you might be thinking, where does this research leave you with a big horse like Shorty? Most of the research that I was looking at and referencing was focusing on lighter breeds like thoroughbreds and standardbreds, but how does that research translate to a big draft horse like Shorty? Obviously he's big, so he must grow slower. So research had a big common denominator across the board, and that was there is no such thing as a slow developing breed. Whether you have a Shetland pony, a quarter horse, a Percheron, they all grow and develop at the same rate. These studies that I looked at of growth rates that looked at the skeletal timeline of a horse, they have the same skeletal timeline, which means their bones and their skeleton grows at the same rate regardless of the breed of horse. The only area where there was a little bit of differentiation, where it could become a little bit trickier, was that the heavier breeds like draft horses, they continue to mature in their muscles and tendons and build overall bulk for a little bit longer, up to an extra year. So this is why, so that's why larger horses might look less developed than these, like say a quarter horse, but they're actually at the same developmental level. The quarter horses have just been bred to look developed sooner versus a draft horse. But just because they look more developed doesn't mean they're more developed in any means. Their skeleton and the important bits, they will develop at the same rate regardless of the size of the horse. With these research articles saying that their muscles develop a little bit slower, I would lead and kind of err on the side of caution and say that they need to be introduced to the workouts at a slower pace. Not that they shouldn't be introduced, but just extra care is needed to make sure you're not overloading their muscles. If they're putting on muscle slowly and building muscle slowly, then you need to stick to the appropriate pace and make sure that you're not overworking them and making them too tired. I hope that makes sense. And also with this slower development of muscle, I think it's really important to note that if the muscle is growing slower, you need to allow the horse to have time to rest. That way their muscles don't get sore. So for horses like Shorty, my Clydesdale, this means that science still supports introducing light work and exposure around 2 or 3 years old to help his bones and joints. With the slower development of the musculature, while it is not expressly mentioned in the research, I found I would lean on the side of caution by providing even slower progress. That's my opinion. When it comes to intensity and duration, making sure to provide these larger horses with greater periods of dynamic rest to allow their muscles more time to adapt to the workout. So that would mean keeping the sessions very controlled and light until these larger horses are physically more filled out. That way the bones and joints are still getting the benefit of the adaptation without overloading the tissues that are still developing. But the key differences in these horses is in appearance and body condition, and not necessarily in bone growth. Draft horses take longer to look finished, and the research still suggests that early, light, well-structured exercise is still beneficial, even for drafts. But what you really want to avoid are long hours, heavy loads, repetitive small circle work, and while the joints and muscles are still adapting. You really want to avoid the mindset that these horses, just because they're bigger, can do larger workloads and longer days than their smaller counterparts. They still develop and grow at the same rate, so you still need to give them the same amount of time to develop and get ready to have their job as they get older. So if you came to this video and you were looking for the magic number of what age should I start my young horse? Should I start them at 2? Should I start them at 5? Sarah, tell me the answer. When should I start my young horse? And my answer is there is no magic number. The research shows it's less about the age where a horse is started and more about the type and progression of the work. So starting young horses in work lightly is not harmful. In fact, it can be beneficial when done thoughtfully. But the key is to But the biggest key is not to confuse starting a horse with hard work. Starting a horse should still be a slow, gradual process, and the horse should be introduced to the exercise, just like you wouldn't go to the gym if you've sat on the couch for a year. You wouldn't go run a mile out of nowhere, because then you're going to be super, super sore. So it's the same thing. You're not going to go run a marathon in 6 weeks if you've never ran before. It's the same for horses. They need to be brought up in this fitness slowly, just like you would bring yourself up as an athlete. So appropriate starting to me means groundwork, short rides, varied terrain, and straight line conditioning, which can all be positive for musculoskeletal development. Progressive training with plenty of turnout helps the bones and tendons adapt safely. But heavier work, collection, high intensity training, any of that kind of stuff, that definitely needs to wait till the horse is more finished, until they're done growing skeletally and the connective tissue development is complete, which is generally when a horse is 5 or 6, which is, for the most part, seems to be a pretty accepted thing. There are still some industries that do harder shows when horses are younger, but for the most part, things I'm looking at doing with my horses, they won't really be doing much until they are older. So, research looks at the effect of riding and training on horses. Another big thing I noticed was the research articles, they really focus on the physical aspect of starting a horse and not so much the mental aspect of starting a horse. So just because there are physical benefits and you can start a horse slowly, not every horse is going to be mentally prepared to start working at a young age. And that is not something that we can easily study and research. It's not like with people where you can do a questionnaire and kind of get a better idea of their mental health or mental soundness. Yeah, a horse is a horse, and they don't speak English or whatever language you speak. So you have to really take a moment and assess the horse's mind frame and say, can they do this calmly? I looked at some articles that were sent to me of individuals who strongly believe in waiting as long as possible to start a horse under saddle. And the main article that people referenced that they were really in love with, when I read the article, I was really surprised, because after I'd read these original research articles about the development and everyone's muscles and their bone structures and how they develop, I was like, okay, someone sent me the opposite opinion. I'm really excited. This is going to be a revolutionary paper that, it's doing all these things that no one else has done before. And be honest, it wasn't. The paper actually just touched on the same topics of when these horses are done growing skeletally, and it said the same thing. Horses are done growing skeletally around 5 years old, and their justification for waiting to start a horse didn't actually have to do with the skeletal development. When you got really into reading it, it was more that horses who are tense in their spine, so I'm trying to explain it as simple as possible, but a horse cannot hold themselves correctly if they are tense. So, as my good friend Ellen always loves to say, tension is the enemy of softness. So, as my good friend likes to say, tension is the enemy of softness. So you will never have a soft, well-carried horse if they're tense. It's impossible. They cannot do it. So the author of this article, she was touching on how she believes that younger horses are going to be more tense mentally. And that's not, it wasn't really to do with their age, more so the factor that when you start a horse, their survival instinct is to not let you on their back. Like, why would an animal want to put themselves in such a vulnerable position? So it is common for a horse to be tense when you go to get on their back. But to me, the paper was a little biased because it's assuming that whenever a young horse is ridden, they're always tense. And I've worked with a lot of talented trainers that's not the case. A lot of their young horses are actually very calm, very relaxed during their first rides because they put in the work and the groundwork and did all the preparation so that the horse is ready mentally. And the caution with that this researcher was giving everyone was that a horse is not going to carry themselves well as an older horse if they're always tense when they're ridden young. That you're riding them young, if they're tense, then you're just reinforcing that tenseness, and they're more likely to have issues collecting and getting soft and being good riding partners as they age. Which I agree, if you're reinforcing that tenseness, you're not going to have a nice horse later on. But I do think it's possible to start a horse young and have them not be tense when you ride them. I just think it goes back to those other articles where it's saying, you know, the instance of a horse being lame at the end of the season had more to do with the trainer than it did to do with the horse. It's all in the training aspects and how the trainer approaches different topics. And I found that really interesting. So what does all this research mean for me and Shorty? What does it mean now that I've gotten through it all? And I'm still reading more just because it was such an interesting topic. I think I will be continuing to dig through different research articles for a while, but I'm going to continue keeping things pretty light for now. Shorty's been doing good, learning to relax. He's been doing really good accepting the saddle, and I'm continuing moving in the direction of having him be bitless or ideally bridleless, which does mean that I am putting in a lot of quality time working on his mindset and getting him responsive to aids without having to do a lot. So I really want him to be a really soft horse. I want him to be very responsive, and that requires a lot of in-hand work with him. But the sessions are really light. So I say I'm doing a lot of work with him, but an average day for Shorty will look like a couple minutes of having neck rope saddle, and we'll just work on cues, doing a little bit of in-hand, making sure he knows how to move his body, and then we'll pull everything off and hose him down and let him relax. So his actual training and carrying a saddle and everything is like 10 minutes of in-hand work. If I do ground driving, it's a little bit longer, 15 minutes of walking around with a saddle. So we're just building up that fitness slowly and really just focusing more on making sure, can he do all the steps calmly? If you watch some of our other videos, the biggest thing too is he's always had this kind of self-defense mechanism, and I'm not going to blame him for it. We've all got our things, but he's very mouthy. We'll be honest, he bit my husband. It was my husband's fault entirely, but Shorty's natural response, and it's a very common natural response with young horses, is to bite. And that comes in all aspects of his training. When he was learning to pick up his hooves, if you were to touch his chestnut, he would try to bite you. And the chestnut's just on the inside of his leg, so if you touch his leg, he'd try to bite you. You touch his back before he was used to you being handled, he tried to bite you. So we're just working through that confidence with him. If Shorty is unconfident in a situation, he will try to take a chunk out of you. So that's not always an ideal moment. So I won't be riding him until I feel like I can ride him without him taking a chunk out of my leg. And that's just because I want him to be comfortable and relaxed, and I also don't like getting hurt. So my biggest thing is I would like to be able to ride him, but I want him to be a confident and comfortable partner. And that's not going to come from rushing the situation. If I were to have followed some other people's advice and just gotten on him, the week I brought him home when he was still a stallion and like not halter broke or anything, I probably would have been tossed off, and that's not the precedent I want to follow. Ideally, Shorty never has a rider fall off of his back, ever. And that shows my mindset. I never want a rider to come off, and I never want to put the horse in a situation where they feel like they need to toss a rider off. So that means I have to put in a lot of groundwork and spend time building that relationship so that the first ride does go very smoothly. If you guys were here, a few months back, I put the first ride on my older horse Vagar, and her first ride was very calm. I hopped on her in a stall, sat there for like 30 seconds, realized she was calm, took out, and we just rode in this pasture for like 5 minutes, and I hopped off. And that was her first ride. There was no shenanigans, no craziness. We just walked for a minute, and that was our ride. And that's what her rides afterwards looked like as well. It was like 5 minutes of walking, and then after about 10 rides, we introduced a little bit of trotting, and then we stopped riding for the rest of the year for some other reasons that if you watch our other videos, you will see her whole journey. But they were not to do with her mindset. She's always been a very calm horse. She is a great driving horse. She's never had a carriage, but she is like the bravest 3-year-old horse I've ever met. She'll go in any new situation like nothing. I'm going to continue working to develop plans for Shorty that focus on building up his mental strength just as much as his physical strength. So we just want to do things that'll make him grow mentally and just build up his confidence, because he lacked a lot of confidence when he first moved here, and that has since grown tremendously. I've been really proud of him. He's even gone on walks, hand walking off the property, and I'm really proud of his bravery and how far he's come along, and we're just going to continue building on that. I just want him to be a confident young horse, and I want him to be relaxed and happy when it comes time to doing his job. And when it comes to lunging, with all those circular studies, I'm not going to say I will never lunge a horse again, but it definitely gave me more to consider and decide if I'm going to use lunging as an exercise. It's something I want to do very strategically, and I want to make sure it is balanced, just because I know if it is unbalanced, you're causing these unideal changes within the body. So I'm not going to say I'll never lunge a horse again, but I will probably be lunging horses and doing circles a lot less than I have in the past. But I'm not going to say I'll never do it again, because there can be benefits, but you definitely don't want to overdo that. So if you found this video helpful, thank you guys so much for making it through the end. I know it was a really long video. I read a lot of research papers. I could only fit so much into this video, but if I encourage you guys, go read those articles and comment below. What's your approach to starting a young horse? What has starting looked like for you in the past? Did this video give you any new information, things you found surprising, not surprising? And yeah, just let me know what you think down in the comments below. I really appreciate seeing what you guys have to say, and I enjoy having conversations in the comments. So definitely leave your thoughts and comments below. If you'd like to know what research articles I was reading and referencing, I'm going to be adding most of them to the description below, as many as I can fit. So we shall see how many I can get in there, but I have those there, and I encourage you guys to go look them up, read them. Unfortunately, a lot of these articles are not free to the public. So I will say, if you get a membership, to just download as many as you can and then read them as you can. Because you can get like a 1-day pass for a lot of these places. But yes, I definitely enjoy reading. Read all the articles. Read everything. Don't not read. Find that information for yourself.